What if the very people sworn to protect you became your worst nightmare? In a city torn apart by racial tension, one traffic stop ignites a powder keg of violence and retribution. Witness the harrowing journey of 3 lives forever changed by a single act of brutality. As protests erupt and chaos reigns, we're forced to confront the uncomfortable truth: justice isn't always blind. James Thompson's eyelids feel heavy as he cruises down the empty Atlanta freeway. It's nearly midnight, and the 32-year-old accountant just wants to get home after a grueling day at the office. The firm's big merger kept him late again, but thoughts of his niece's upcoming zoo trip bring a tired smile to his face. Suddenly, flashing lights in his rearview mirror shatter the peaceful night. James's heart rate spikes as he guides his car to the shoulder, his mind racing. He's done nothing wrong, but fear creeps in nonetheless. 2 officers approach, their hands hovering near their holsters. James grips the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. Officer Wilson's face appears at the driver's side window, a mask of suspicion and authority. "License and registration," he barks, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. James nods, trying to keep his breathing steady as he reaches for his wallet. Every movement feels exaggerated, dangerous even, as he acutely aware of how the officers might perceive him. "What's the problem, officer?" James asks, his voice betraying a slight tremor as he hands over his documents. Wilson doesn't answer immediately, scrutinizing the license with narrowed eyes. The silence stretches, oppressive and filled with unspoken tension. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Wilson finally commands, his hand now resting on his weapon. James feels a surge of indignation. He's done nothing to warrant this treatment. "Officer, I don't understand." "I wasn't speeding," Wilson cuts him off sharply. "I said, step out of the vehicle. Now." The situation escalates rapidly as James, confusion and anger battling within him, complies. Harsh words are exchanged, voices rising in the quiet night air. James tries to explain, to reason, but his words seem to fall on deaf ears. In a blur of motion and shouted commands, James finds himself face down on the rough asphalt. The world spins, his cheek scraping against the ground as he struggles to understand what's happening. "Stop resisting!" Wilson yells, though James isn't fighting back. He's simply trying to protect himself from the onslaught. The cold metal of handcuffs bites into James's wrists, the click of the lock sounding like a death knell to his hopes of resolving this peacefully. Officer Wilson's knee presses into his back, making it difficult to breathe. James gasps, pain and fear mingling as the weight on his spine increases. "Please," James manages to choke out, "I can't breathe." But his pleas seem to fall on deaf ears. The night that started with dreams of a happy weekend with his niece has devolved into a nightmare of flashing lights, rough pavement, and the terrifying realization that his life could be in danger. As James lies there, pinned and helpless, his mind races. How did a routine traffic stop turn into this? What had he done to deserve such treatment? And most chillingly, would he make it home tonight? The answers elude him as the cold night air bites at his exposed skin, a stark reminder of how quickly one's world can be turned upside down. While James grapples with his nightmare, Officer Wilson stands tall, convinced of his actions. But what unseen forces shape a policeman's judgment in the heat of the moment? The next few minutes will challenge everything you thought you knew about law enforcement. Officer Michael Wilson's eyes scan the freeway, his body tense with anticipation. At 41, he's seen his fair share of trouble, but lately, things feel different. The recent spike in car thefts weighs heavily on his mind, each stolen vehicle a personal affront to his duty to protect and serve. As James' car comes into view, something doesn't sit right with Wilson. He can't put his finger on it, but years on the force have honed his instincts. "Let's run those plates," he mutters to his partner, Rookie Officer Sarah Chen. She nods, her fingers flying over the patrol car's computer. Wilson's mind races as they wait for the results. He thinks about the briefing earlier that week, the captain's stern warnings about a new gang operating in the area. Every car becomes a potential threat, every driver a possible criminal. The constant vigilance is exhausting, but Wilson tells himself it's necessary. It's what keeps the city safe. Chen shifts nervously in her seat, the silence between them charged with tension. Wilson notices her unease but doesn't acknowledge it. She'll learn, he thinks. She'll understand that hesitation can be deadly in this line of work. As they approach James' vehicle, Wilson's training kicks in automatically. His hand hovers near his holster, eyes darting from the driver's side mirror to the back seat, looking for any sign of danger. The driver's movements catch his attention, they seem erratic, unpredictable. Wilson's heart rate quickens, adrenaline flooding his system. Keep your eyes open, he warns Chen as they step out of the patrol car. Wilson approaches the driver's side, his face a mask of authority. He barks out commands, each word clipped and precise. The driver, James, though Wilson doesn't think of him by name, fumbles for his wallet. In that split second, Wilson's world narrows to a pinpoint. The reaching motion triggers something primal in him, a deeply ingrained fear response honed by years of training videos showing officers gunned down during routine stops. He doesn't think, he reacts. Wilson's weapon is in his hand before he realizes he's drawn it. "Hands where I can see them," he shouts, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. Everything happens so fast after that. James' confusion, the shouted commands, the struggle as Wilson tries to subdue him. In the chaos that follows, Wilson convinces himself he's doing what's necessary to maintain control. Each escalation feels justified in the moment, the takedown, the handcuffs, the knee on James' back. A small voice in the back of Wilson's mind whispers that this is wrong, that it's gone too far, but he silences it. He can't afford doubt, not when his life and his partner's could be on the line. As James lies pinned to the ground, Wilson stands over him, breathing heavily. The rush of adrenaline begins to subside, leaving him shaky and uncertain. He looks at Chen, sees the shock in her eyes, and feels a flicker of doubt. But he pushes it away. This is the job, he tells himself. This is what it takes to keep the streets safe. The mantra rings hollow in the cold night air, but Wilson clings to it like a lifeline as the consequences of his actions begin to unfold around him. In the blink of an eye, a routine traffic stop transforms into a nightmare. What pushes a trained officer to cross the line, and at what cost to those caught in the crossfire? James' face presses against the rough pavement, each struggled breath causing his cheek to scrape painfully. The cold asphalt bites into his skin, a stark contrast to the warm night air. Officer Wilson's voice cuts through the silence, tight with adrenaline and barely controlled fear. "Stop resisting," he shouts, though James isn't fighting back. James tries to explain, to reason with the officers, but his words are drowned out by the sound of his own pulse thundering in his ears. "Please," he manages to gasp, "I'm not resisting. I can't breathe." But his pleas fall on deaf ears. The weight on his back increases suddenly, forcing the air from his lungs in a pained wheeze. A sharp pain lances through James' shoulder as his arm is wrenched behind him. He cries out, the sound raw and primal. The officer's grip is like iron, unyielding despite James' obvious distress. In that moment, James realizes with terrifying clarity that his well-being is no longer a concern to those sworn to protect him. Officer Chen stands frozen, her eyes wide with shock as she watches her partner's actions become increasingly aggressive. She opens her mouth to speak, to intervene, but the words catch in her throat. Her training never prepared her for this. The reality of the situation crashes over her like a tidal wave, leaving her paralyzed with indecision. James' pleas turn to screams as the beating intensifies. The night air fills with the sickening sound of impact, fists connecting with flesh, boots striking ribs. Each blow sends waves of agony through James' body. He curls in on himself, trying desperately to protect his vital organs from the onslaught. Time loses all meaning for James. Seconds stretch into eternity as the assault continues. His world narrows to a pinpoint of pain and fear. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice wonders if he'll survive this encounter. The thought of his family, of his niece waiting for their zoo trip, flashes through his mind. It gives him the strength to hold on, to endure. When it's finally over, James lies motionless on the ground. His body is a canvas of bruises and blood, each breath sending shockwaves of pain through his battered form. The fight has left him entirely, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and a creeping numbness that's almost worse than the pain. Officer Wilson stands over James, breathing heavily. His knuckles are raw and bloodied, his uniform disheveled. As the adrenaline begins to fade, he tries to process what just happened. The justifications that seemed so clear moments ago begin to crumble in the face of the brutality he's inflicted. A seed of doubt takes root in his mind, threatening to unravel everything he thought he knew about his role as a protector of the peace. The scene is eerily quiet now, save for James' labored breathing and the distant sound of approaching sirens. The flashing lights of the patrol car cast alternating red and blue shadows across the tableau, a grim reminder of the thin line between order and chaos that has been irrevocably crossed this night. The wail of approaching sirens grows louder, heralding the arrival of backup and emergency services. But as dawn breaks over this shattered scene, which version of events will the world believe? The truth lies trapped between two conflicting narratives, each threatening to tear the city apart. Flashing lights paint the night in surreal hues as more police cruisers converge on the scene. Paramedics rush to James' side, their practiced hands moving with grim efficiency. They catalog his injuries in clipped, professional tones that belie the brutality of what's occurred. Multiple contusions, possible internal bleeding, suspected fractured ribs. Each word is a damning indictment of the violence inflicted upon him. As James is carefully loaded into the ambulance, Officer Wilson stands apart, his face a mask of determination. He recounts his version of events to the newly arrived officers, his words carefully chosen. The suspect was combative from the start, he insists, painting a picture of James as a dangerous threat that needed to be neutralized. I feared for my safety and that of my partner. Wilson's voice doesn't waver, but his eyes betray a flicker of doubt. Nearby, Officer Chen hesitates when asked for her statement. Her gaze flicks between Wilson and the departing ambulance, uncertainty etched across her features. When she finally speaks, her account diverges subtly from her partner's. It happened so fast, she stammers, her words at odds with the confidence expected of an officer. I'm not sure I saw everything clearly. At the hospital, James drifts in and out of consciousness, each moment of clarity bringing fresh waves of pain and confusion. The harsh fluorescent lights blur into a hazy glow as doctors and nurses work to assess and treat his injuries. In the waiting room, James' family arrives in a panic, their faces etched with worry and growing anger as they learn what's happened. While James fights for his life, another battle begins in the world outside. News of the incident spreads like wildfire through social media and local news outlets. Shaky cell phone footage captured by a passing motorist ignites fierce debates online. Some defend the officer's actions, citing the dangers of police work. Others cry out against what they see as yet another example of systemic racism and police brutality. By morning, two distinct narratives have solidified. On one side, supporters of law enforcement hail Officer Wilson as a hero who neutralized a potential threat. They point to James' size and the inherent dangers officers face every day. The other side sees a clear-cut case of racial profiling and excessive force, demanding justice for an innocent man brutalized by those sworn to protect him. As the sun rises over Atlanta, the city holds its collective breath. Community leaders and police officials scramble to address the situation, aware that this incident could be the spark that ignites long-simmering tensions. In homes, offices, and on street corners, people debate what they've seen and heard, their discussions charged with emotion and deeply held beliefs. The truth of what happened that night lies somewhere between these conflicting accounts, but uncovering it will require confronting uncomfortable realities about race, power, and justice in America. As James fights for recovery and Officer Wilson grapples with the consequences of his actions, the city braces itself for the storm that's surely coming. They say the camera doesn't lie, but what happens when the truth it reveals threatens to tear a city apart? Detective Lisa Ramirez is about to find out as she steps into an investigation that will test her resolve and challenge everything she thought she knew about justice. Detective Ramirez leans back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. The harsh glow of her computer screen illuminates her face in the dimly lit office. It's well past midnight, but sleep eludes her as she reviews the body cam footage for the 5th time. Each viewing reveals new details, subtle nuances that could make or break the case. The internal affairs investigation into the incident faces intense public scrutiny. Ramirez feels the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. She knows that every move she makes will be dissected by the media, the community, and her fellow officers. The pressure to get this right is immense. As she watches the footage again, Ramirez notices discrepancies between the officer's statements and the video evidence. Officer Wilson's account of James Thompson's aggressive behavior doesn't quite match what she sees on screen. The timestamps don't align with his version of events, and the level of force used seems disproportionate to the threat presented. Ramirez spends the next few days interviewing witnesses, each account adding another layer of complexity to the case. A passerby describes hearing shouting before she saw James on the ground. A resident in a nearby apartment building recalls the sound of a struggle, but couldn't see what was happening. With each interview, the detective feels like she's assembling a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. When Ramirez questions Officer Wilson, he maintains his actions were justified. His jaw is set, eyes steely as he recounts the events of that night. "I feared for my life," he insists, his voice unwavering. "Thompson was combative from the start. I did what I had to do to protect myself and my partner." But there's something in his demeanor that doesn't sit right with Ramirez. A flicker of doubt, perhaps, or a hint of rehearsed conviction. Officer Chen, on the other hand, seems less certain. Her hands tremble slightly as she gives her statement. "It happened so fast," she says, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure I saw everything clearly." Ramirez notes the rookie officer's hesitation, wondering what Chen might be holding back. James Thompson provides his own harrowing account from his hospital bed. His voice is weak, punctuated by winces of pain as he describes the terror of that night. "I thought I was going to die," he tells Ramirez, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I kept trying to tell them I wasn't resisting, but they wouldn't listen." The rawness of his emotions strikes a chord with the detective, reminding her of the very real human cost of this incident. As Ramirez concludes her initial findings, the evidence points toward a disturbing conclusion. Despite the potential backlash, she recommends charges against Officer Wilson. The decision weighs heavily on her, knowing the ripple effects it will have throughout the department and the community. The police union's response is swift and forceful. They immediately push back against the recommendation, citing Wilson's exemplary record and the dangers officers face daily. Their statement lands like a gauntlet thrown, setting the stage for a contentious legal battle that threatens to divide the city even further. Ramirez stares out her office window at the city lights, knowing that the real fight is just beginning. As the sun rises on a new day, she steels herself for the challenges ahead, determined to see justice served, no matter the cost. While Ramirez fights for justice within the system, forces beyond her control are about to change the game entirely. On street corners and in living rooms across the city, a movement is taking shape. But will it bring the change people are desperate for, or spiral into something far more dangerous? Marcus Johnson's voice booms through the megaphone, cutting through the humid Atlanta air. The crowd before him swells with each passing moment, a sea of angry faces and homemade signs demanding justice. "How many more?" he shouts, his words echoing off nearby buildings. "How many more of our brothers and sisters must suffer before we say enough is enough?" The crowd roars in response, their collective voice a thunderous cry for change. It's been a week since James Thompson's brutal encounter with the police, and the community's outrage has only intensified. What started as a small gathering outside the precinct has grown into a massive demonstration that threatens to overwhelm the city's downtown. As Marcus continues to speak, his words painting a vivid picture of systemic injustice. City officials watch from behind closed doors with growing unease. Mayor Angela Thompson paces her office, phone pressed to her ear as she tries to navigate the crisis. "We need to address this head-on," she insists to her advisors, her voice tight with stress. "But how do we maintain order without further inflaming tensions?" Outside, the protest grows more heated. A group of young men and women break away from the main crowd, their faces contorted with rage as they march toward the police line. Officers in riot gear tense visibly, hands tightening on their shields. The air crackles with tension, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Across town, in a quiet hospital room, James Thompson watches the news coverage with a mix of awe and apprehension. His family surrounds him, their faces etched with worry. James' sister, Tanya, grips his hand tightly. "They're calling us for interviews," she says softly. "They want us to speak at the next rally." James closes his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of expectation suddenly thrust upon him. He never asked to be the face of a movement, to have his pain splashed across every news channel and social media feed. But as he looks at his family, at the determination in their eyes, he knows he can't stay silent. As the protests intensify, so too does the backlash. Counter-demonstrators begin to appear, waving thin blue-line flags and shouting support for the police. "He should have just complied," one man yells, his face red with anger. "Our officers put their lives on the line every day." The clash of ideologies plays out on street corners and social media, each side becoming more entrenched in their beliefs. Local businesses board up their windows, fearing the possibility of riots. Schools debate whether to close, worried about student safety as tensions rise. After days of mounting pressure, the city finally announces that officers Wilson and Chen will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Mayor Thompson delivers the news at a hastily arranged press conference, her voice steady despite the dark circles under her eyes. For many in the community, this small step feels woefully inadequate. Administrative leave? Marcus scoffs when he hears the news. They should be in jail, not on a paid vacation. The announcement, rather than calming the situation, seems to add fuel to the fire of discontent. As night falls over Atlanta, the city holds its breath. The protests show no signs of abating, and the wounds of years of perceived injustice remain raw and open. In living rooms and community centers, on street corners and in church basements, people gather to plan their next moves. The fight for justice, they know, is far from over. The city may sleep, but the news cycle never rests. As dawn breaks over Atlanta, Christine Lee straightens her blazer and takes a deep breath. In just moments, she'll go live to millions of viewers, tasked with making sense of a situation that seems to grow more complex by the hour. But in her gut, she knows this story is about to take a turn that no one saw coming. We're live in 3, 2, 1. The producer's voice fades as the breaking news graphic flashes across screens nationwide. Christine's face fills the frame, her expression a carefully crafted blend of concern and professionalism. "Good morning. We begin today with shocking new developments in the James Thompson case." Her words hang in the air for a moment before she continues. Leaked bodycam footage has surfaced online, offering a disturbing glimpse into the moments leading up to Mr. Thompson's alleged assault by police. As Christine speaks, grainy video clips play on a split screen. The footage is choppy and incomplete, but the violence it depicts is unmistakable. Social media explodes with reactions, the incident now trending across every platform. Pundits and talking heads fill the airwaves, each offering their own spin on the unfolding drama. In the days that follow, James Thompson's past becomes fodder for endless speculation. Some media outlets dig into his background with alarming ferocity, seemingly searching for any detail that might justify the officer's actions. A speeding ticket from 5 years ago. A heated argument with a neighbor captured on a doorbell camera. Each morsel of information is dissected and debated ad nauseam. Meanwhile, Officer Wilson's record comes under equally intense scrutiny. Previous complaints surface, ranging from excessive force allegations to racially charged comments overheard by fellow officers. The revelations add fuel to the fire of public outrage, with protesters citing them as evidence of systemic issues within the police force. Social media becomes a battleground of competing narratives. Hashtags supporting both James and Officer Wilson trend simultaneously, each side accusing the other of manipulating facts to fit their agenda. Video clips, both real and doctored, circulate widely. Fact-checkers struggle to keep up with the deluge of misinformation. The constant media coverage begins to take its toll on all involved. James, still recovering in the hospital, finds himself overwhelmed by the attention. His family members are hounded by reporters every time they step outside, their every move scrutinized for hidden meaning. Tanya, James' sister, stands before a forest of microphones outside the hospital. Her eyes are rimmed with exhaustion, her voice trembling slightly as she speaks. "We appreciate the support we've received, but right now our focus is on James' recovery. Please, we're asking for privacy during this difficult time." But privacy proves elusive in the age of viral outrage. Amateur sleuths pore over every available scrap of information, constructing elaborate theories about what really happened that night on the Atlanta freeway. Online forums buzz with speculation, some well-meaning, others far more sinister. As the media frenzy reaches a fever pitch, the lines between reporting and sensationalism blur. Christine Lee finds herself grappling with the ethics of her profession, torn between the public's right to know and the very real human cost of non-stop coverage. In a quiet moment between broadcasts, Christine stares at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The weight of responsibility settles heavily on her shoulders. She knows that every word she speaks, every story she chooses to highlight, has the power to shape public opinion and potentially influence the course of justice. As she splashes cold water on her face, Christine steels herself for the long road ahead, aware that in the court of public opinion, the verdict is still very much undecided. The media circus fades into the background as a new arena takes center stage. Attorney Sarah Martinez stands before the towering courthouse steps, her crisp suit a stark contrast to the swirling chaos of protesters and counter-protesters behind her. She takes a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle ahead. This isn't just another case, it's a powder keg that could reshape the very fabric of American justice. Inside the courtroom, the air crackles with tension as jury selection begins. Each potential juror faces a barrage of questions, their answers revealing the deep-seated biases that permeate society. A middle-aged woman admits she can't help but see her son in James Thompson's shoes. An older man confesses his unwavering support for law enforcement, his voice tinged with defiance. The attorneys on both sides work tirelessly, searching for 12 individuals who can set aside their preconceptions and judge solely on the facts presented. As the trial unfolds, the prosecution builds its case like a relentless tide. The body cam footage plays on loop, each viewing more gut-wrenching than the last. James Thompson's injuries are catalogued in clinical detail, the bruises and fractures a stark testament to the violence inflicted upon him. Eyewitness accounts paint a picture of a routine traffic stop spiraling into a nightmare of excessive force. Officer Wilson's defense team counters with equal fervor. They portray a dedicated officer thrust into a split-second decision, his actions born of genuine fear for his safety. Training manuals are dissected, procedures scrutinized. The defense argues that Wilson followed protocol to the letter, his response a textbook example of how to handle a potentially dangerous suspect. Expert witnesses from both sides engage in verbal sparring matches, their testimony often devolving into heated debates about proper police procedure. A use of force expert insists Wilson's actions were justified given the perceived threat level. A civil rights attorney counters, arguing that unconscious bias led to an unnecessary escalation of violence. As the trial progresses, its implications reach far beyond the fate of Officer Wilson. In coffee shops and living rooms across the nation, people debate the larger issues at play. How much force is too much? Can implicit bias be truly overcome? The very foundations of policing in America seem to be on trial alongside Wilson. Outside the courthouse, the city holds its breath. Storefronts board up their windows, a grim reminder of the riots that followed the initial incident. Community leaders work tirelessly to keep the peace, organizing vigils and forums for peaceful dialogue. But beneath the surface, a current of tension runs strong. Everyone knows that regardless of the verdict, the aftermath could reshape Atlanta's future. In the quiet moments between testimonies, Sarah Martinez catches glimpses of James Thompson and Officer Wilson. She sees the toll this ordeal has taken on both men, the pain etched in James' face, the haunted look in Wilson's eyes. As she prepares her closing arguments, Sarah knows that no matter the outcome, there will be no true winners in this case. The scars left behind will take far longer to heal than any physical wounds. While the courtroom drama captivates the public, a silent battle rages within the police department itself. Officer Sarah Chen stands at a crossroads, her choice poised to send shockwaves through the entire force. But at what cost? Sarah's hands tremble as she splashes cold water on her face, trying to quell the nausea churning in her stomach. The harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct bathroom cast unflattering shadows across her features, accentuating the dark circles under her eyes. She barely recognizes the woman staring back at her in the mirror. For days, Sarah has replayed the night of James Thompson's arrest in her mind, each memory bringing a fresh wave of guilt and uncertainty. She sees James' face contorted in pain, hears his desperate pleas for mercy. And she remembers her own inaction, the paralyzing fear that kept her rooted to the spot as her partner, Officer Wilson, crossed a line she never thought possible. The weight of her impending decision presses down on Sarah like a physical force. Testify truthfully about what she witnessed, potentially ending her partner's career and marking herself as a traitor to the force? Or maintain the blue wall of silence, protecting Wilson but betraying her own conscience and the oath she swore to serve and protect? Sarah's phone buzzes in her pocket, another in a string of messages from fellow officers. Some offer thinly veiled threats, warning of the consequences should she turn rat. Others promise unwavering support, urging her to do the right thing. Each notification sends a jolt of anxiety through her system, a reminder of the impossible choice she faces. As she leans against the cool tile wall, Sarah's mind drifts to her academy days, to the ideals of justice and integrity that drew her to this career in the first place. She remembers the pride she felt when she first put on her uniform, the sense of purpose that came with protecting her community. Now, that once gleaming badge feels like a lead weight around her neck. Sarah closes her eyes, picturing the courtroom where she'll soon take the stand. She imagines the sea of faces that will watch her every move, hanging on her every word. James Thompson and his family, seeking justice for the pain they've endured. Officer Wilson, his future hanging in the balance. The entire police force, wondering if she'll uphold the unspoken code or break ranks. With a shaky breath, Sarah straightens her uniform and meets her own gaze in the mirror. The decision crystallizes within her, bringing both relief and a new kind of fear. She knows that whatever choice she makes, her life will never be the same. Friendships will be tested, her career path forever altered. But as she squares her shoulders and reaches for the door handle, Sarah feels a flicker of something she hasn't experienced in weeks: hope. The courtroom falls silent as Sarah takes the witness stand, a hush of anticipation settling over the room. She feels the weight of every eye upon her, the collective breath held as she prepares to speak. Sarah's heart pounds in her chest, but her voice is steady as she raises her right hand and swears to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. In this moment, with the world watching, Officer Sarah Chen chooses her path. Days of testimony blur together, a kaleidoscope of conflicting accounts. Now, 12 strangers hold the power to rewrite history. But as the verdict is read, no one is prepared for what comes next. The courtroom buzzes with nervous energy as the jury files in. Weeks of grueling testimony have led to this moment. James Thompson sits rigidly in his wheelchair, his family forming a protective circle around him. His mother clutches his hand, her knuckles white with tension. Across the aisle, Officer Michael Wilson maintains a stoic facade, but the slight tremor in his clasped hands betrays his inner turmoil. Judge Harriet Saunders calls for order, her gavel's sharp crack cutting through the low murmur of whispers. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asks, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of the moment. The jury foreman rises slowly, a folded piece of paper clutched in his trembling fingers. "We have, Your Honor," he says, his voice barely audible over the thundering heartbeats of those gathered. Time seems to stretch and warp as the foreman unfolds the paper. James closes his eyes, a silent prayer on his lips. Officer Wilson's jaw clenches, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. The air in the courtroom grows thick, almost suffocating with anticipation. On the charge of excessive use of force, we find the defendant, Officer Michael Wilson. The foreman pauses, taking a deep breath. The entire room holds its collective breath, teetering on the edge of a knife. "Not guilty." A collective gasp ripples through the courtroom, followed by a moment of stunned silence. James' family recoils as if physically struck, disbelief etched across their faces. Officer Wilson's shoulders sag with visible relief, but there's no joy in his eyes, only a haunted weariness. The foreman continues, his voice growing stronger with each pronouncement. "On the charge of assault and battery, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of official misconduct, we find the defendant not guilty." As the litany of "not guilty" verdicts continues, a low rumble of discontent begins to build in the gallery. James' mother lets out a keening wail of anguish, the sound cutting through the formal proceedings like a knife. Tears stream down James' face as he stares blankly ahead, the weight of injustice crushing down upon him. Outside the courthouse, word of the verdict spreads like wildfire. The crowd that has gathered throughout the trial erupts into chaos. Shouts of anger and despair mingle with cries of vindication from Wilson's supporters. Police in riot gear form a protective line around the building's entrance, their faces grim behind clear plastic shields. Back inside, Judge Saunders struggles to maintain order. Her gavel pounds a staccato rhythm as she calls for silence. "This court is adjourned," she declares, her voice barely audible over the rising tide of voices. As the reality of the verdict sinks in, the Thompson family huddles together, their faces masks of grief and disbelief. James' sister, Tanya, turns to the sea of reporters pushing forward for comment. Her voice shakes with barely contained fury as she speaks. "This isn't justice," she declares. "This is a travesty. But mark my words, this fight isn't over." Officer Wilson is quickly ushered out a side entrance by his legal team, away from the press and the growing crowd. As he slides into a waiting car, his eyes meet those of Sarah Chen, his former partner. The look they exchange is heavy with unspoken words, relief, guilt, and the knowledge that while the trial may be over, the repercussions of that fateful night are far from finished. Sarah Chen watches her former partner disappear into the night, knowing this isn't the end. Across town, Marcus Johnson steps up to a microphone, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. The spark of outrage is about to ignite a powder keg of long-suppressed rage. Marcus's eyes burn with intensity as he addresses the swelling crowd outside the courthouse. His words, raw and unfiltered, cut through the night air. "They call this justice," he roars, his voice cracking with emotion. "A man beaten within an inch of his life, and his attackers walk free?" The crowd responds with a deafening chorus of anger and disbelief. As night falls, the peaceful protests that began in the afternoon take on a darker edge. The air grows thick with tension, a mix of fear and righteous indignation palpable among the gathered masses. Chants of "no justice, no peace" echo off buildings, growing louder and more insistent with each repetition. A young woman, her face streaked with tears of frustration, hurls a bottle at a line of stoic police officers. The sound of shattering glass seems to trigger something in the crowd. Suddenly, the night explodes into chaos. A Molotov cocktail arcs through the air, its flame trailing like a comet against the dark sky. Time seems to slow as it reaches the apex of its flight, then comes crashing down onto the hood of a parked police cruiser. The vehicle erupts in a ball of fire, casting sinister shadows across the faces of both protesters and police. Riot police move in, their visors reflecting the dancing flames of burning buildings and vehicles. The acrid smell of tear gas mingles with the smoke, creating a choking haze. The sound of breaking glass and distant sirens forms a hellish symphony of urban unrest. Miles away, in the sterile quiet of his hospital room, James Thompson watches the unfolding chaos on TV. Tears stream silently down his face as he witnesses his city tear itself apart. The pain medication dulls his physical aches, but does nothing to numb the anguish in his heart. This violence, this destruction, it wasn't what he wanted. Not in his name. By midnight, Atlanta is engulfed in a full-scale riot. Years of pent-up anger, frustration, and distrust of the system pour out onto the streets in a tide of destruction. Looters smash storefront windows, carting away whatever they can carry. In some neighborhoods, residents form human chains to protect local businesses, their faces a mix of determination and fear. The overwhelmed police force struggles to contain the spreading violence. Officers who hours ago stood guard at the courthouse now find themselves retreating from advancing crowds, outnumbered and increasingly desperate. In the governor's mansion, frantic phone calls are made as officials debate calling in the National Guard. The gravity of the situation becomes clearer with each passing minute. This is no longer just about one man or one verdict. It's the unleashing of generations of pain and systemic injustice. As dawn approaches, the city lies wounded, smoke rising from multiple fires across its skyline. The riots show no sign of abating, and a grim realization sets in among city leaders: the powder keg has exploded, and there's no telling how far the damage will spread before the flames can be extinguished. Dawn breaks over Atlanta, revealing a city transformed overnight. Mayor Angela Thompson stands before a forest of microphones, her normally composed demeanor cracking under the weight of the moment. Her voice wavers as she addresses the camera, the bags under her eyes betraying a sleepless night of crisis management. "My fellow Atlantans," she begins, her words carried live across every local channel, "the events of the past 24 hours have left our beloved city scarred and divided. The damage we've witnessed is not just to our buildings and streets, but to the very fabric of our community." As the mayor speaks, aerial footage plays on split screens, showcasing the extent of the destruction. Entire city blocks lie in ruins, the charred husks of businesses and vehicles creating an apocalyptic landscape. Smoke still rises from smoldering fires, casting a haze over neighborhoods that only yesterday bustled with life. In the wake of the riots, a dangerous dance unfolds on the streets. Opportunistic looters dart between broken storefronts, arms laden with stolen goods. Just blocks away, groups of peaceful protesters form human chains, desperately trying to protect local businesses from further damage. Their faces are etched with determination and sorrow, a visual representation of a community at war with itself. The city's police force finds itself in an impossible position. Officers, many having worked through the night without rest, struggle to maintain order while acutely aware of the powder keg surrounding them. Every interaction is charged with tension, the memory of James Thompson's beating and Officer Wilson's acquittal hovering like a specter over each encounter. Social media becomes a battleground of its own. Twitter and Facebook explode with conflicting narratives, eyewitness accounts, and passionate pleas. Some call for peace and reconciliation, sharing images of community members cleaning up debris. Others fan the flames of outrage, circulating videos of police clashing with protesters and demanding further action. In homes across Atlanta, families huddle together, unsure of what the coming hours might bring. Parents struggle to explain the situation to wide-eyed children, while simultaneously checking the locks on doors and windows. The distant wail of sirens provides a constant, unsettling soundtrack to their anxiety. As the sun climbs higher, casting harsh light on the aftermath, the full extent of the damage becomes impossible to ignore. Mayor Thompson's voice cracks as she concludes her address. "The road ahead will not be easy," she admits, "but we must come together as one Atlanta. Our divisions run deep, deeper than many of us realized." But it is only by confronting these painful truths that we can begin to heal. The camera pans out, revealing a city holding its collective breath. Smoke still rises from scattered fires, a visual reminder of the anger that exploded overnight. But as residents tentatively emerge from their homes, there are small signs of hope. Neighbors embrace on street corners. Volunteers appear with brooms and trash bags, ready to begin the long process of rebuilding. Atlanta lies wounded, its deep-seated racial divisions laid bare for all to see. The path forward is uncertain, but in the warm light of a new day, there's a glimmer of possibility that from this pain, something stronger might emerge. Weeks after the riots, Atlanta begins the slow process of rebuilding and reconciliation. James Thompson stands before a sea of cameras, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. The weight of expectation presses down on his shoulders as he prepares to address the city. He takes a deep breath, steadying himself. "I never asked to be a symbol," James begins, his voice wavering slightly. "But here I stand, asking all of you, my neighbors, my community, to choose a path of peace." His eyes scan the crowd, taking in the mix of hope and skepticism on their faces. "We've seen the cost of violence. Now we must do the hard work of healing." As James speaks, calling for systemic change and accountability, the city listens with bated breath. His words resonate with many, while others shift uncomfortably, resistant to the idea of sweeping reforms. The speech becomes a catalyst, igniting conversations in living rooms and boardrooms across Atlanta. In the days that follow, community leaders and police officials engage in tense but necessary dialogues. The air crackles with unresolved tension as they sit across from each other, years of mistrust and misunderstanding between them. Progress is slow, marked by heated arguments and moments of unexpected breakthrough. Officer Michael Wilson, cleared of charges but ostracized by many of his former colleagues, grapples with the consequences of his actions. He walks the streets of his neighborhood, feeling the weight of suspicious glances and whispered comments. At night, he lies awake, replaying the fateful traffic stop in his mind, wondering if he could have done things differently. Grassroots organizations seize the moment, pushing hard for police reform. They organize rallies, flood city council meetings, and launch social media campaigns. Their efforts are met with a mix of support and resistance. Some see their proposals as a necessary step towards justice, while others view them as an attack on law enforcement. Small steps are taken. The police department announces new training programs focused on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias awareness. A proposal for a civilian oversight board gains traction, though its exact powers remain a point of heated debate. These changes, while significant, feel like mere drops in an ocean of needed reform to many activists. As weeks turn to months, the physical scars of the riots begin to heal. Burned-out buildings are replaced by new construction, their fresh facades a stark contrast to the lingering emotional wounds. The city remains on edge, acutely aware that true healing will require more than quick fixes and surface-level changes. James Thompson watches it all unfold from his newly accessible apartment, his injuries a constant reminder of how far they've come and how far they have to go. He thinks of Officer Wilson, of the pain and fear on both sides of the badge. As night falls over Atlanta, James closes his eyes, hoping that someday, somehow, his city will find its way to true justice and reconciliation. The mural looms over James Thompson, its stark colors a vivid reminder of that fateful night 1 year ago. His own face stares back at him, bruised and battered, a permanent fixture in the neighborhood that has become both a symbol of injustice and a rallying point for change. James reaches out, his fingers tracing the rough brick, feeling the weight of everything that has happened since his encounter with Officer Wilson. As the anniversary approaches, a familiar tension creeps back into the city. James can sense it in the air, in the wary glances between neighbors, in the increased police presence on street corners. Progress has been frustratingly slow. For every small victory in police reform, there seem to be 2 steps backward. Body cameras are now mandatory, but the footage isn't always released promptly. A civilian review board has been established, but its recommendations are often ignored. James closes his eyes, trying to steady his breathing as a police siren wails in the distance. The sound still sets his heart racing, triggering vivid flashbacks of that night on the freeway. His therapist calls it PTSD, but to James, it feels like his body betraying him, unable to let go of the trauma. He's made progress, but some days the fear and anger threaten to overwhelm him all over again. Across town, Officer Sarah Chin adjusts her uniform, preparing for another day of community outreach. Her decision to testify truthfully at Wilson's trial cost her old friendships and nearly derailed her career. Now, she walks a delicate line, trying to rebuild trust with a community that views the badge with suspicion while navigating the resentment of some fellow officers who see her as a traitor. Chen's work is part of the city's attempt at reform. There are new training programs, diversity initiatives, and efforts to increase transparency. But to many residents, especially in communities of color, these changes feel superficial. The underlying issues of systemic racism and unchecked power remain largely unaddressed. James opens his eyes, his gaze drawn to a fresh bouquet of flowers placed at the base of the mural. It's a small gesture, but one that reminds him he's not alone in this fight. He thinks of the community meetings he's attended, the marches he's participated in, the countless conversations he's had with people on all sides of the issue. There have been moments of frustration and despair, but also glimmers of hope and understanding. As he stands there, reflecting on how far they've come and how far they still have to go, James hears the sound of distant chanting. Another protest is forming, voices rising in a familiar call for justice and accountability. The sound stirs something in him, a mix of weariness and determination. James takes a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. The fight is far from over, but he's no longer just a victim. He's become a voice for change, a reluctant leader in a movement larger than himself. As he turns away from the mural, ready to join the gathering crowd, James knows that the true measure of progress isn't just in policy changes or training programs. It's in the hearts and minds of the community, in the difficult conversations and small acts of empathy that slowly, painfully, begin to bridge the divide between fear and understanding. As James joins the crowd, echoes of his story reverberate far beyond Atlanta's city limits. In the halls of Congress, a determined woman prepares to ignite a firestorm. How will one city's tragedy reshape the nation's approach to justice? Congresswoman Evelyn Davis stands at her desk, fingers trembling slightly as she adjusts her glasses. The weight of the moment presses down on her shoulders. In just a few minutes, she'll introduce a police reform bill that could fundamentally alter law enforcement across the country. Davis takes a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle ahead. The events in Atlanta have sparked a national reckoning on racial justice and policing. James Thompson's brutal beating and the subsequent riots have become a rallying cry for change, forcing lawmakers to confront long-ignored issues of systemic racism and police brutality. As Davis prepares to speak, she knows her words will ignite fierce debate on both sides of the aisle. Political lines are quickly drawn as various factions stake out their positions. Progressive lawmakers push for sweeping reforms, while more conservative voices argue for a measured approach. The tension in the chamber is palpable as Davis outlines the key points of her bill: increased accountability, stricter use of force guidelines, and perhaps most controversially, changes to qualified immunity. James Thompson's testimony before Congress becomes a pivotal moment in the push for federal action. His voice wavers as he recounts that fateful night, the pain and fear still evident in his eyes. "I thought I was going to die," he tells the hushed chamber. And when the system failed to hold anyone accountable, it felt like dying all over again. His words cut through the political noise, forcing even the most hardened opponents to confront the human cost of inaction. Outside the halls of power, the debate rages on. Police unions mobilize against the proposed changes, arguing that limiting qualified immunity will make officers hesitant to act in dangerous situations. Reform advocates counter that the current system allows bad actors to escape consequences for egregious misconduct. Town halls and community meetings across the country become heated battlegrounds as citizens grapple with these complex issues. The movement faces significant backlash as some politicians seize on fears of rising crime and urban unrest. Law and order becomes a rallying cry for those opposed to reform, with vivid images of burning buildings and looted stores plastered across campaign ads. James and other activists find themselves not only fighting for change but also defending their right to peaceful protest. After weeks of intense debate and negotiations, Davis's bill finally comes to a vote in the House. The atmosphere is electric as representatives cast their ballots, each vote inching the tally closer to the threshold needed for passage. When the final count is announced, cheers erupt from reform advocates in the gallery. The bill has cleared its first major hurdle, but the celebration is tempered by the knowledge that an even greater challenge lies ahead in the Senate. The upper chamber, with its different political makeup and procedural rules, presents a formidable obstacle. As the bill moves forward, communities across the country watch with bated breath, acutely aware that their own futures hang in the balance of this national debate. While the politicians debate in marbled halls, the true test of change unfolds in the most unexpected place, a sixth-grade classroom. What happens when childhood innocence collides with the harsh realities of systemic injustice? 12-year-old Zoe Thompson stands at the front of her classroom, her hands fidgeting with the edges of her note cards. The fluorescent lights seem unusually harsh today, illuminating the sea of curious faces before her. Zoe takes a deep breath, steadying herself as she begins her presentation on a topic that has reshaped her young life, her Uncle James' encounter with police brutality and its aftermath. Last year, my Uncle James was beaten by police during a traffic stop, Zoe begins, her voice wavering slightly. The room falls silent, her classmates leaning forward in their seats. Some exchange uncomfortable glances, while others listen with rapt attention. Zoe continues, recounting the night that changed everything, the fear, the pain, the long nights in the hospital. As Zoe speaks, she notices the shifting expressions on her peers' faces. Some look shocked, others confused, and a few nod in grim understanding. She talks about the protests that followed, the way her neighborhood transformed overnight. "I saw people I've known my whole life shouting in the streets," Zoe explains. "But I also saw them coming together to clean up afterward, to help each other." The young girl's words paint a vivid picture of a community in turmoil, struggling to find a path forward. She describes the new police training programs her mom told her about, and the community meetings where people from all sides try to find common ground. But Zoe doesn't shy away from the hard truths either. She talks about the lingering tension, the way some of her neighbors still cross the street when they see a police car. As Zoe shares her own conflicted feelings, her voice grows stronger. "Sometimes I'm scared when I see a police officer," she admits. "But then I remember Officer Chen, who comes to our community center. She's kind and listens to us. I want to believe things can get better." The classroom is pin-drop quiet as Zoe concludes with her hopes for the future. She speaks of a world where everyone feels safe, where justice is truly blind, and where the color of someone's skin doesn't determine how they're treated. As she finishes, her teacher, Ms. Rivera, hesitates for a moment. This isn't a topic she's entirely comfortable navigating, but she recognizes its importance. "Thank you, Zoe," Ms. Rivera says, her voice gentle. "Does anyone have any thoughts they'd like to share?" Slowly, hands begin to rise. What follows is a discussion unlike any the class has had before. Students share their own experiences, ask questions, and grapple with concepts far beyond their years. As the bell rings, signaling the end of class, Zoe's classmates file out with thoughtful expressions. Some approach her, offering words of support or asking follow-up questions. Zoe feels a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She realizes that this conversation, however difficult, is just the beginning. Gathering her things, Zoe catches her reflection in the classroom window. She sees not just a 12-year-old girl, but a member of a generation that will inherit these challenges, and the responsibility to address them. With a deep breath, she steps into the hallway, ready to face whatever comes next. The camera pans across Atlanta's skyline, a city forever changed. Scars of past violence are still visible, boarded-up windows, graffitied walls, but signs of renewal emerge. A community garden blooms where a burned-out building once stood. Children laugh on a playground newly rebuilt after the riots. James Thompson's voice carries over the scene, tinged with both weariness and hope. Our story isn't over. It's being written every day, by every one of us. The path forward isn't easy, but it's one we must walk together. The final image settles on a community center. Inside, James stands at a podium, his face etched with determination. Beside him, to the surprise of many, is Sarah Chen, no longer in uniform, but still committed to change. Their unlikely partnership embodies the difficult, necessary work of bridging divides and building understanding. As they face the crowded room, ready to speak, the seed of a new chapter for Atlanta takes root.